one of the things I talk about a lot is the why behind why moms have symptoms. You and I, we can have the exact same pelvic floor symptoms. We can have the exact same leakage, prolapse, things like that, but completely different reasons why we get there. I talk about that in a post today about how, we've got some, people that are told, oh gosh, pelvic floor PT didn't work, I'm doomed, when actually the services that they were provided were subpar. And I've gotten some interesting messages today where people are like, yeah, that happened to me. Like people going, they trust this person, they're told to do 1,000,001 Kegels, it doesn't work. They quit, and then they try and, source their information on social, which is fine because I put information out too, realize that they actually have overactivity and they were doing the opposite of what they should be doing. So again, goes back to the why. Do we need to focus on a muscle that's too tight and needs to relax first and strengthen later? Or we start with, is the why that the muscle just needs to be strengthened? So I talk about that a lot, and then I hop on a group today, and it's a pelvic therapist group. So there are PTs and there are OTs in this. That's a whole nother conversation. And the person was like, hey, I was walking in heels. I haven't done it in a long time. It really made my bladder irritated. What's up with that? And the first thing I think of is, and part of this is because I had hip surgery almost 16 years ago. I've dealt with bladder issues. I've dealt with my hip pissing off my bladder issues because the obturator internus, which is a hip rotator, basically kind of cradles the bladder, and there's some fascial connections there. And so anytime I have somebody that has bladder issues, I'm going to ask, hey, do you have anything going on with your hip or your back? Because I understand that connection. I was educated as an orthopedic physical therapist first, and then a pelvic floor PT, and then mashed them up. So that's automatically the first place I go. But we're getting therapists now that are not orthopedically trained, which is fine. If you're not orthopedically trained, know when to refer out. Or they're occupational therapists and they've never received, nor is it part of their scope of practice, to have orthopedic training, musculoskeletal training for the lower extremity. And some of the stuff that came out, it was like, oh, well, when you're on when you're wearing heels, your pelvis is tipped forward and your bladder smashes into your pubic bone. Okay, so I'm pretending for a second I know nothing. I'm like, oh my God, that sounds awful. Doesn't it sound awful? If you're in a pelvic tilt, which sounds scary, by the way, it's normal. Your bladder would smash into your pubic bone and piss off your bladder. That sounds very plausible, right? Except for the fact that we're not that fucking delicate. And why is it, that you can have people walk around in their tiptoes and wear heels all the time and their bladders are just fine? Drives me bananas. And this is where I want to say there's a couple things that are coming through with this. A lot of these things can sound perfectly plausible if this is the only thing that you know. If you do not understand the mechanics of walking, if you do not understand the mechanics of how walking in heels is different than walking barefoot or regular shoes, if you don't understand that, if you don't understand the implications on the hip, if you haven't carried that forward to understand how the hip can implicate and impact the bladder, then sure, smashing a bladder into a pubic bone sounds very plausible, except for that's not how this works. It just isn't. So whenever I hear, and this is not me trying to attack anybody or, oh God, you're wrong, you suck. This is like, okay, can we just be logical for a second and use our brains? Like, pelvic floor physical therapy should not be like going to McDonald's. And if I order a Big Mac, I automatically, if I order, treatment for pelvic organ prolapse, I get the same thing as everybody else. If you order a Big Mac and I order a Big Mac, we get the same thing. No, this should be have it your way, okay? We should have it your way. We need to ask ourselves, unfortunately, as clinicians and as moms, okay, think about this for a second. Think about the explanation that, that they're providing me. A bladder smashing into a pubic bone when you're up on tiptoes on your heels. Okay. Well, a lot of people do that. Why doesn't everybody have bladder problems that are walking on tiptoes or walking in heels? Why don't our kids have problems? Why don't our men have problems? Because men have bladders too, and they have, some walk in heels, some walk tiptoe. Why me? Why is this a problem for me? And I think when you ask that question, then it becomes a really silly question, like, oh, it can't be that. It's got to be more complex than that. And it is. And that's where we pull the orthopedics and the biomechanics and, multi-system and that kind of stuff. But until we stop just accepting these ridiculous explanations and really being like, okay, well, if that's the deal for me, why doesn't everybody else have that? And that's the question I always tell clients. I was like, look, even you, let's say you were a dancer, you were super flexible, or, we're having this conversation and there's somebody identical to you that maybe they were a dancer and they had a similar delivery and they're not having these issues. What is it about your particular scenario that we're sitting here and having this conversation right now? What is it about your recipe of how you got here that's why we're having this conversation? That's why you're having these symptoms. That's what we're trying to figure out. And if we keep handing out therapy like it's a Big Mac, and in some cases, I will be honest, like, my rule of thirds, like a third of people, it really doesn't matter what they get. They'll be fine. A third of people, generic information, totally fine. A third of the people, they need to have it their way. You need to figure out what that recipe is for the secret sauce. You can't just give them a Big Mac and assume that they're going to be fine. And I think this is where, as providers, we need to recognize, what are we doing? Do they deserve the straightforward, okay, I give everybody with this diagnosis the same thing? Or should we really be listening a lot more to, what is their history prior to having kids? What did their pregnancy history look like? Any orthopedic history? And if that is not part of your scope of practice, work with somebody who it is. And this is pelvic floor PTs as well. If you do not have orthopedic background, you better have an orthopedic PT in your back pocket that you can collaborate with. I'm lucky enough that I have both. That's just how I evolved in my career. If you are an OT and it is not your scope of practice, you better have a pelvic floor PT and you better have an orthopedic PT on speed dial. I'm a little passionate about this because I hear, literally, this is my whole entire day with patients, is they've gone to see somebody else and, did exactly what they were told to do. And then they come back in and they're like, oh no, you're no better. You're just not working hard enough. Or you didn't do things the way I asked you to. It's your fault. Tired of the freaking guilt trip. Tired of it. When it's the provider that is not asking the right question, or because the issue is far beyond their scope of practice, they're only working here, and then they're leading that client to feel like, oh, it's your fault, or you're not going to get better, when it's actually their limitations that's the problem. So I want to hear your stories. I want to hear your stories if you're a provider. I want to hear your stories if you have gone through this before and you felt that you haven't been listened to before, or you feel like, somebody told you to do something, you're like, no, that actually isn't it. I want to hear them. So hop in my DMs. I would love to hear it because you are not crazy. This drives me bananas. We got to figure out how to fix it. I am trying, but we got to do better. All right. We'll see you in the DMs. Hey, Keaton. Bye.